More or less. So cool. Thank you for having me here this evening. Now, people that know me often tell me that I'm really no good at jokes. And to be fair, they've got a point. And to be fair, what I'm going to be talking to you this evening isn't really a laughing matter. So in that spirit, I'm going to start with a punchline. I hope you don't mind. So the airport hasn't yet got the permissions that it needs, but it's planning to expand. The airport's consultants are trying to convince us, as you rightly pointed out, that the emissions impact of such expansion is infinitesimal. But I've looked into it, my colleagues have looked into it, and we can tell you that that's simply not true. I've spent a lot of time looking into the data, and I found that to offset the emissions from the additional flights of this expansion, you would need to reforest an area the size of the whole of North Somerset every 4 months. Now, to put that into context, I'm going to present to you a bit of information about the climate emergency, which I'm sure I'll be preaching to the converted when I do that, and then I'll kind of walk you through the analysis that we did to arrive at that pretty damning stat. So a bit of scene setting, two of the important actors in climate change. We've got the IPCC, who was set up in the late 80s and are kind of the voice of international scientists. If you want anyone to give you the stats about climate change without any politics, without any hype, it's the IPCC. And then in 2015, the UN agreed the Paris Agreement, which was where unanimously all the countries in the world agreed to limit global warming to 2 degrees above the kind of 1850 to 1900 average, but aim to keep it to 1.5. But these all happened a couple of years ago, and you may be wondering why we're talking about this now. But essentially, last October, the IPCC, this voice of reason, released a report which was the first time that the difference between these two thresholds that may otherwise seem fairly arbitrary, 1.5 and 2 degrees, were really explored. And what they found was really, really stark. The impacts of a 1.5 degree world and the impacts of a 2 degree world are really, really different. And one of the lead authors, I'll quote her here, said that the report is a line in the sand. And what it says to our species is that this is the moment and we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community, and I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. So to put that into context, 1.5 degrees above rising. On the left-hand side, we've got some of the past temperature records that we've observed. And you can see that this was from the IPCC report last year, but essentially in 2017, we were already 1 degree above global warming. So we're already well on our way. And in the most optimistic scenarios, which is what is shown here, we reached that so-called safe limit of 1.5 degrees somewhere around 2040. The optimistic scenarios say that we'll hit there at 2030. And that's if everything goes to plan, if governments start to act now and take the really drastic action that the IPCC is telling us is necessary. And so these are emissions projections that are possibly along the yellow and green at the bottom. But what we've got at the moment is a scenario where the pledges and the policies that governments have put in place are no way near meeting that. So estimates are maybe around the blue, which is leading us to 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees. But it's very possible that if they don't work or if the policies don't actually come through, we could be talking about 4 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. And I know this all feels really arbitrary, but as someone who studies the impacts of what this means for communities in the UK and around the world, 0.5 degree of warming every decade terrifies me. And I really want to kind of bring that home. But there is some hope, because since that report was released, it really has motivated some action in the UK and internationally. I'm sure you've been aware of it, but the climate emergency declarations, Baines has had one, North Somerset, even Bristol recently. So that's really encouraging. We have declarations of kind of recognizing that we are in an emergency situation and committing to carbon neutrality by 2030. Even the national government a few weeks back, maybe a couple months ago now, committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. So, I mean, for reasons I won't go into, that's far too late, but we are starting to get this traction in legislation. But for now, that's all that really is. That is just a target, and it hasn't yet been followed through with the actions. And the actions we need to see are doing more of the good things, so the renewables, the public transport, but also, really importantly, doing less of the bad things. Which brings me neatly on to Bristol Airport. So, for the next few slides, there's going to be a lot of charts. But what we've got up here is we've got emissions on the left axis, and we've got the emissions from North Somerset Council, in which the airport is situated over that time. So these are the emissions that are labelled as within the sphere of influence of the council. So that includes emissions from my house or houses like yours, from the cars and the buses that pass through, as well as all the businesses in the area. In 2017, that was around 1 million tons of carbon dioxide, a megaton. And they have committed to getting that to zero by 2030. With some really hard work from the council, with some transformative changes that will affect every single one of the residents in that council, they are going to hit carbon neutrality by 2030, which is a fantastic effort. But what this doesn't include is emissions from the aircraft that are leaving the airport within those boundaries. So if I include some historic emissions taken from the airport master plan and also from the planning application, historic observed emissions, then these layer on top like that. So this isn't hidden behind, this is stacked on top. And in 2017, the latest data shows that they added around 750,000 tons. So about 75% of the entire county's emissions were added on top just from the flights coming from the council. The council currently, obviously has a planning application in at the moment, but under its current planning permissions, has the ability to continue expanding up to around 10 million passengers. So it's not at that limit yet. If we assume that it continues to grow over the next few years, and hits that 10 million pack, then you can see in the darker blue, the emissions grow slightly. And then this is where we start now talking about the application that sits with North Somerset Council at the moment. So the first phase of that is an expansion to 12 million. You start to notice a pattern. And essentially what the pattern is that all the efforts of the people in North Somerset, all the efforts of North Somerset councillors are completely neutralised by the expanding airport. And the overall emissions coming from North Somerset aren't changing at all. And I wish I could stop there, but the 12 million cap is just the beginning of the planning application. It's part of a longer-term strategy to increase to 20 million. So if we add that into the equation, then you can see further out, way past 2030, that all the efforts that have been put in are not just neutralised, but it gets worse. By 2040, we're talking about just over 2 megatons of carbon dioxide every single year. And I wish I could stop there. But this is just talking about carbon dioxide. And without getting too technical, there is a real difference between carbon dioxide that's emitted from a car on the road and from a plane in the sky. So the altitude it's emitted at, along with something called contrails, which is kind of the water vapor, the clouds that you see, means that, it's a term called radiative forcing, means that the impact of carbon emissions from planes is a lot worse. And the estimates are between 2 and 4. You can take the total of carbon emissions and multiply it by 2 to 4 to get the true climate impact of planes. So let's be conservative and let's just double it. And that's what it begins to look like. But what this also doesn't take into account is something called well-to-wheels emissions. So the fuel doesn't magically appear in the tank of the airplane. It has to be extracted from the ground, it has to be refined, it has to be transported to the planes. And so if we add these on, we get a little bit more. And also, if you go a little further again, to deal with an expanded airport, we're going to need more planes. And to build a plane, you need emissions to go into that. So if we start taking this into account, it's a small line, but it's not inconsequential at all. This line is around 86,000 tons, which is actually bigger than any single source of emissions in North Somerset at the moment. So just from the construction of these additional planes. So it seems small, but this is just because we're talking about absolutely huge quantities. And I wish I could stop there. But there's also this one, which is from actually running the airport. So additional transport of internally and the energy in the terminal, everything. So yeah, and I wish I could stop here. But now I get onto the planning convention, which is one of the most ridiculous things I think. If you have a plane going from A to B, only airport B accounts for the emissions of that flight. So if you've got the flights going out, then they're accounted for in the receiving airport. And so normally when you've got a stable network of flights, that's fine, because otherwise you'd be double counting emissions all the time and you get an airport accounting for 2 flights, but then, that makes sense. But in this case, in this expansion, you allow for flights going out, but also flights coming in. And none of those flights would be in the air if this airport wasn't expanding. So it makes absolutely no sense to attribute the emissions from the flights going one way to some arbitrary airport in Europe or elsewhere in the UK, when that wouldn't be happening in this expansion. So although that makes sense in a steady state, it doesn't make sense in the context of an expansion planning application. So if we add that on, then you get this pink on top. And although it's got a lot of pretty colours, it doesn't actually paint a very pretty picture. And you'll be glad to hear that that is the end of it. But I think I can paint a slightly prettier picture, which is an alternative scenario. And in that alternative scenario, the airport, for whatever reason, it might be public pressure, doesn't give permission for the expansion. What would that picture look like? None of the extra 8, 10 million passengers a year are allowed through. And we get a picture that's more like this. So the difference here that we've shown in red is a difference by around 2040 of 4.5 million tonnes. So that's 4.5 times the contribution of the entire county every single year that is hinging on this planning application that's currently in North Somerset at the moment. So again, I know this feels arbitrary, but that total is absolutely staggering. And I know I've absolutely whizzed through this, but if you want to take a look at the numbers yourself, then my colleague Adrian Gibbs has published a blog on this, which if you Google Bristol Airport just plain wrong, that's plain like a plane, not plain like you'd expect it to be spelled. Or maybe you would expect it to be spelled that way. So yeah, Bristol Airport just plain wrong, and then you can take a look at that in more detail yourself. But just to contextualize that a little bit, we've just kind of turned that into what it would take to offset those emissions. And so you can, so trees as they grow, they absorb carbon, and that becomes part of their bark. And it relates to 4.5 million tonnes a year, becomes 430 square miles of forest, which is an area the size of North Somerset every 4 months. That's 3 North Somersets a year. That's 3 North Somersets that you would have to sow with forest, nurture for 40, 50 years till they're mature, and then leave. And that is absolutely impossible. So just to try and like ram home just how important this decision is. And I'll conclude that the climate emergency is happening quickly, and our window for action from the most reasonable voices in the scientific community are telling us that we need to act now on it. An emergency requires preventative intervention. So it's currently in the hands for North Somerset in the planning system. The old rules of economic development versus the expense of the environment can't really be allowed to rule this decision anymore. Like, we need to empower the North Somerset Council to say no. But one last bit of good news is that in Stansted are going through a similar process at the moment. They're a little bit further ahead than Bristol Airport, but they've also had an expansion application in at the moment, and they delivered a petition of around 1,600 people from the local community to Uttlesford Council. And that was enough for Uttlesford Council to call an extraordinary meeting, and all of a sudden it had provisional approval, and they've now called it in because they needed to look at the bigger picture. So I hope I've given to you an idea of what our bigger picture is, and I hope you see that as a call to action. So thank you.